Tonight, as you close your eyes and let the quiet take hold, imagine something strange, a world ruled not by order, but by contradiction. Monarchs sitting on thrones made of gold and silence, emperors who never spoke, kings who laughed as their kingdoms burned. These were not figures from fairy tales. These were real rulers crowned and recorded in history, whose lives unfolded like riddles that never fully resolved. What does it mean to hold absolute power yet drift so far from reason that reality itself bends? Across centuries and empires, from frozen Siberian palaces to sunlit desert courts, history has quietly carried the stories of rulers whose lives defy logic. Some were cruel, some were kind, most were simply bizarre, and in their strangeness they reveal something about all of us. How easily order dissolves into paradox when no one dares to speak against a king. Tonight, you will not learn simple history. You will fall into it. Step by step, ruler by ruler, we will walk the forgotten halls and broken thrones of the world's most peculiar monarchs. No single answer will emerge. Only echoes, loops, the feeling that power itself is a kind of sleep from which some rulers never fully wake. And now we begin with the first name, the first throne, the first impossible crown. You stand beneath marble arches so tall they seem to scrape against the sky, sunlight filtering down through great pillars that cast long shadows across polished stone. Around you, the city moves with the weight of an empire, senators whispering beneath colonnades, soldiers in gleaming armor patrolling wide avenues, merchants calling out prices in languages gathered from every edge of the known world. Rome, eternal, ordered, immense. And at its heart, on a raised platform in a forum that smells of crushed herbs and burning oil, stands one man. His robes shimmer with purple and gold. His face is calm. And yet, as you watch him raise his hand in silence, a quieter thought moves beneath your skin like a chill. This is not the emperor of history books. This is the emperor of whispers, of rumors. The mad Roman emperor. His name is Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, but the world remembers him by another name, Caligula. His title once meant Little Boots, a nickname given when he was a child, dressed as a soldier among his father's legions. But as an adult, the name carried darker weight, madness wrapped in gold. The Roman Empire under Caligula, as recorded by historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, sits in a strange loop between fact and legend. Officially, Caligula ruled from 37 to 41 CE, a reign short by imperial standards, but endlessly large in memory. The records tell of lavish feasts where entire gardens were served on platters, of horses appointed to high office, of statues of gods having their heads removed so they could be replaced with Caligula's own likeness. Yet beneath these stories, historians find a quieter, more complex truth. Psychologists studying historical perception call this phenomenon magnification. When a figure holds both immense power and visible instability, every action they take becomes amplified in memory. Ordinary cruelty becomes mythic. Ordinary extravagance becomes monstrous. Imagine now standing in one of Caligula's palaces, the walls painted with impossible colors, blues mined from Afghan stones, reds mixed with rare earths. Servants move like shadows, heads bowed low, and at the center Caligula himself sits not in rage, but in perfect silence, watching, thinking. Modern researchers suggest that Caligula may have suffered from medical conditions, possibly lead poisoning from Roman pipes, epilepsy or mental illness triggered by traumatic events. His father was poisoned, his mother and brothers were executed. By the time he rose to power, paranoia was woven into his bones as surely as gold thread in royal robes. There's another layer, absolute power paradox. Cognitive science shows how unchecked authority can bend even stable minds. Experiments like the Stanford prison study reveal how ordinary people placed in positions of unchecked control over others quickly exhibit erratic or destructive behavior. Caligula's madness may not have been only personal. It may have been structural, inevitable within Rome's system of emperor worship. Now reflect inward. How many quiet loops in your own life have been shaped, not by intention, but by roles too large for your original self? Psychologists call this role expansion distortion. You start as one thing, a student, a worker, a leader, and slowly, the role reshapes you. The paradox deepens when considering how Caligula died, assassinated not by foreign enemies, but by his own guards and advisors, stabbed to death in a hallway, his body left cooling on marble tiles, his wife and daughter murdered alongside him. Imagine again standing beneath those arches, the sun still bright, but the shadows darker now. A city too large to stop moving, even as its ruler's blood stains its stones. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still picture Caligula not as a man but as a symbol laughing in gold, eyes wild with something neither fully human nor entirely divine. That's the recursive tyrant effect. Once a ruler's madness is recorded, it loops endlessly in memory, becoming larger than any single fact. There's also collective stability projection. Roman society depended on the idea of order, senates, laws, roads, but its memory preserved Caligula as the exception, the wild card that proved the rule. Think now about your own internal rulers, parts of yourself that hold too much control over your decisions, habits, fears, impulses. Are they stable, or have they grown mad over time, shaped by silence rather than balance? The quiet trap becomes clear. History remembers extremes more than balance. The most stable rulers fade into dust. The maddest burn forever in gold. Imagine one final moment standing beneath a statue of Caligula, the face worn smooth by centuries of reign, his name carved in stone, half erased, yet still there, still watching. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet empires of thought, walking marble halls between reason and silence, ask yourself, if even history's greatest powers could be reshaped not by truth, but by the quiet spread of madness, how many of your own quiet thrones are waiting quietly to be balanced again, not by force, but by remembering who you were before the crown ever touched your head? You stand in a grand hall where sunlight drifts in through windows so high they seem to belong to the sky rather than the earth. Chandeliers hang like frozen stars overhead, casting quiet gold across endless marble floors. Velvet curtains ripple in the breeze, and at the center of it all stands a throne. But no one sits in it, or so it seems. Look closer, there he is. A man in royal robes, slumped, as if asleep. Head tilted, mouth slightly open, eyes half closed, the sleeping king, Spain's quiet monarch. But as you step closer, the silence deepens like a slow breath held too long. Because this is no ordinary sleep. This is the sleep of history itself, trapped in a loop that never quite wakes. His name was Charles II of Spain, the last ruler of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. And in his time he was known across Europe, not for his words or battles, but for his silences, his strange heavy sleep, his long absences from public life. Historians describe him as the monarch who ruled a crumbling empire from behind closed doors, too sick and too quiet to stop the slow collapse around him. Charles II was born in 1661, and from his first breath, his life was marked by something called the Habsburg curse. Centuries of intermarriage among royal families had left him with severe physical and mental disabilities. His jaw so deformed he could barely chew, his body frail, his speech slurred. Modern geneticists reviewing his family tree call it one of the clearest examples of inbreeding collapse in European royal history. But what fascinated his subjects and terrified them was his sleep. For hours, sometimes days, Charles would fall into deep, unresponsive trances. Court physicians recorded it as a kind of waking coma. Sometimes he would rise in the middle of the night, walking through the palace as if haunted, eyes open but empty. They called it the king's sleep. This ties into a psychological phenomenon known as symbolic inertia. When a leader becomes a symbol rather than an active force, their stillness begins to feel more powerful than their actions. Charles' sleep wasn't just seen as a personal affliction, it was read as a sign, a kingdom drifting as its king dreamed. Imagine now standing beside him, not in a throne room, but in his private chambers, heavy curtains drawn, candles flickering low. The king sitting in a high-backed chair, unmoving, eyes half-lidded, his servants waiting in silence, unsure whether he would speak or sleep for another day. There's another layer. The absent monarch effect. Psychologists studying leadership perception show that when a ruler disappears physically or mentally, the people below them often fill the silence with rumor and projection. Stories grew in Spain that Charles was possessed, that he could not die until some ancient curse was lifted, that he spoke to angels in his sleep. Now reflect inward. How many parts of your own life have fallen into a kind of sleep, not moving forward, not falling apart, simply drifting? Psychologists call this state suspension bias, a period where nothing changes feels safer than risk, so silence is mistaken for control. The paradox deepens with the political consequences. Under Charles II, Spain's once mighty empire, rich from colonies in the Americas, slipped into slow decline. Wars lost, territories ceded, the royal treasury emptied, and yet no one dared replace him. His sleep became the kingdom's sleep. Imagine again standing in the royal court, courtiers whispering behind fans, foreign ambassadors watching with cold eyes, and always at the center the king still, unmoving, dreaming. Even now, knowing the quieter truths of his condition, part of you may still feel the weight of that silent throne. That's the recursive sleep loop. When a figure's absence becomes so familiar it begins to feel permanent, unchangeable. There lives also collective sleep projection. Historians note how societies facing slow collapse often mirror their leaders. Under Charles II, whole Spain became quieter, festivals fewer, public life subdued, while nations sleepwalking alongside its king. Think now about your own quiet monarchs, the habits or thoughts you've placed on a silent throne inside yourself. Are they still ruling, or simply sleeping too long? The quiet trap becomes clear. People feared waking Charles II as much as they feared losing him. His sleep was safer than the chaos that might follow. Imagine one final moment standing outside the palace as dawn rises. The city silent, the sky turning pale gold. Somewhere inside, the king still sleeps, Spain waiting endlessly for a ruler who might never fully wake. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet palaces of thought, walking halls both grand and still, ask yourself, if even history's greatest powers can fall into silence not through defeat, but through endless sleep, how many of your own quiet kingdoms are waiting, not for revolution, but simply for you to open your eyes again and remember how to move? You stand in a marble hall carved into the side of a mountain, cold air drifting through high stone windows, torches burn along the walls, but the light feels dim, smoke curling like slow-moving snakes. At the far end of the room, a man sits upon a blackened throne, his crown forged not of gold, but of iron and silver. He lifts a goblet to his lips, tilting it back slowly. No fear crosses his face, no hesitation. Because for him, poison is not death, it is life. This is Mithridates VI, of Pontus, the Poison King. His story begins not in Rome but along the southern coast of the Black Sea, in a kingdom called Pontus. Born around 120 BCE, Mithridates grew up under constant threat. His own mother was said to have plotted against him, poisoning his father, then keeping him under close watch to control his inheritance. But he survived, and when he finally claimed the throne, he carried that early lesson with him. Trust no one, and never let yourself be vulnerable. It is said that Mithridates made himself immune to poison by taking small doses every day, a method known today as Mithridatism, named after him. Historians debate whether the practice truly worked, but Roman writers like Pliny the Elder described it in detail. A man who feared betrayal so deeply he turned his own blood into an antidote. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called controlled exposure conditioning. Studies in behavioral science show that humans can sometimes build resistance to harmful substances or experiences through gradual measured exposure. But more than biology, Mithridates' practice reflected a deeper loop, the obsession with control. Imagine now standing beside him, not in battle but in his private chambers, silver trays laid out with tiny vials and powders, servants watching in silence as he measures each dose with the precision of a priest. One drop more or less, and the ritual would turn fatal. There lived a curious boy named Oliver. Cognitive researchers studying leadership psychology find that rulers under constant threat of assassination develop complex systems of ritual, secrecy, and self-defense. For Mithridates, this included not just poison resistance but an entire empire of alchemy and espionage. He fought Rome for decades, leading the Mithridatic Wars. Time after time, he escaped their armies through mountain passes, hidden tunnels, loyal allies. His legend grew until Roman poets called him the Eastern Scourge, a man unkillable by blade, by arrow, or by cup. Now reflect inward. How many quiet poisons exist in your own life? Things you fear so much you've built habits around controlling them. Psychologists call this defensive habit formation. Rituals that begin as protection but eventually shape your entire identity. The paradox deepens with Mithridates' death. After years of war and betrayal, including by his own sons, he faced defeat. And here is where history closes its loop. When Mithridates finally chose to take poison, it didn't work. His own Mithridatism had made him immune. According to Roman historian Appian, he had to order a guard to kill him with a sword instead. Imagine again standing in that mountain hall as the last light fades, a king surrounded by empty vials, silver trays scattered across the floor, his final defense becoming his final trap. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still picture Mithridates as immortal, not because he truly was, but because he made himself so in the mind of history. That's the recursive defense loop when protection becomes identity, so deeply ingrained it no longer matters whether the threat was real. There's also legacy poisoning. Psychologists studying cultural memory find that figures associated with danger or control, like the Poison King, are remembered longer. Not because of their victories, but because of the myths wrapped around their fears. Think now about your own internal rituals. The small defenses you repeat every day without thinking, are they still serving you, or have they become the poison they were meant to prevent? The quiet trap becomes clear. The very thing Mithridates used to guard himself eventually made escape impossible. Imagine one final moment standing on the edge of his blackened throne room as dawn breaks beyond the mountain. The silver vials gleam in the first light. The hall is empty now. No king. No poison, only the echo of a mind that refused to be vulnerable until even death had to find another way in. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet fortresses of habit and belief, ask yourself, if even history's most guarded rulers could be trapped by the very things that once kept them safe, how many of your own quiet defenses are waiting not to protect you, but to be gently, finally set down? The figure of the child pharaoh in ancient Egypt is a paradoxical one, a young ruler thrust into power, often unable to fully grasp the weight of the crown placed upon their head. History, as it relates to monarchs, is generally filled with images of seasoned rulers who rise to the throne through battle diplomacy or dynastic succession. But in ancient Egypt, there was another reality. Sometimes the future of an empire rested on the shoulders of a child, someone barely able to comprehend the role they were about to play in shaping the civilization. Egypt, with its complex political and religious landscape, saw multiple rulers who were children when they ascended to the throne. Their reigns were often marked by the regency of advisors, power struggles, and in some cases, short and tragic lives. The child pharaoh is not merely an anomaly in Egyptian history, but a central figure representing the fleeting nature of power and the complex intersection between youth, divine rule, and legacy. Once upon a time, in a quaint little village nestled among rolling hills and towering trees, there lived a curious boy named Oliver. His reign, while short and relatively uneventful in terms of military or political conquest, became one of the most famous in Egyptian history due to the discovery of his tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter. Tutankhamun's father, Akhenaten, had introduced controversial religious reforms that disrupted Egypt's traditional polytheistic worship in favor of Aten, the sun disk. When Akhenaten died, the kingdom was in turmoil and Tutankhamun, a child, was placed on the throne. His role as pharaoh was more ceremonial than executive, as the real political power was held by a regent, most likely one of Akhenaten's advisors. During Tutankhamun's reign, the priesthood of Amun was restored to its previous power and the country returned to its traditional religious practices. However, Tutankhamun's life was tragically short and he died around the age of 18, leaving no heirs. The circumstances of his death remain mysterious, with some theories suggesting illness, injury, or even foul play. The famous discovery of his tomb in the Valley of the Kings in Luxor in 1922 was a turning point in Egyptology, revealing a treasure trove of artifacts, including his iconic golden mask, which would make Tutankhamun one of the most recognizable figures in history. Yet, despite the vast amount of wealth and prestige associated with his tomb, Tutankhamun's reign itself was relatively inconsequential. The real influence of his legacy stems from the archaeological wonder of his tomb, rather than from any significant political achievement. The paradox of Tutankhamun's reign lies in the fact that a young child, placed in a position of immense power, left behind one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history, but his own role as pharaoh was more symbolic than substantive. He was a figurehead, a ruler whose reign was defined more by the historical legacy surrounding his tomb than by his actions on the throne. Another notable child monarch in ancient Egypt was King Pepi II, who ascended to the throne at the age of 6, making him the longest reigning pharaoh in Egyptian history, with a reign that lasted for 94 years. Pepi II, the last ruler of Egypt's 6th dynasty, ruled through a time of political instability and decline. His reign is often considered the beginning of Egypt's Old Kingdom's collapse, though it lasted for an impressively long period. His childhood reign was shaped by a regency, likely controlled by the powerful nobles of the time. As he grew older, Pepi II's control over the kingdom weakened, and his reign saw the fracturing of royal authority and the rise of regional governors who exercised considerable autonomy. By the end of his reign, Egypt had entered a period of decentralization, marking the decline of the central power that had characterized the Old Kingdom. The paradox of Pepi II's reign is that his youth and the power wielded by others in his name were key to the breakdown of centralized control. As a child ruler, Pepi II was dependent on the regency of his advisors, but as he grew older he found it increasingly difficult to maintain authority over his vast empire. His reign is a study in contrasts, while his longevity as pharaoh is a testament to his ability to survive in a turbulent time. The decline of Egypt during his reign suggests that a child on the throne, despite the long duration of rule, might have been a contributing factor to the weakening of centralized authority. Amenhotep II, another significant child pharaoh, ruled Egypt for nearly 26 years during the 18th dynasty. He became pharaoh at a young age, but unlike some of the other child rulers of Egypt, his reign was not solely marked by the influence of regents or advisors. Though he ascended to the throne after the death of his father Thutmose I, Amenhotep II was able to assert his authority and lead military campaigns. However, much of his reign is defined by a series of administrative changes rather than military conquests. Amenhotep II is also known for his extensive building projects, including the construction of several temples and monuments dedicated to the gods of Egypt. His reign, though marked by peace, stability, and cultural achievements, was also marred by the growing influence of powerful regional governors, which began to erode the central authority of the monarchy. Despite his youthful ascent to power, Amenhotep II's reign laid the groundwork for the eventual decline of the new kingdom. The paradox of Amenhotep II's reign lies in the fact that, although he ruled as a child and later grew into a more independent leader, his efforts were ultimately overshadowed by the pressures of maintaining control over an ever-expanding empire. He demonstrated that a young ruler could indeed command authority, but also that the shifting dynamics of power, internal strife, and external threats would ultimately undermine the centralized strength that Egypt had enjoyed during the height of the new kingdom. The reigns of these child pharaohs exemplify a broader theme in the history of monarchy: the fragility of power in the hands of youth. Although these monarchs were born into positions of great privilege, their reigns were often overshadowed by the influence of regents, advisors, and factions that held real power. These child rulers, while officially crowned as kings of Egypt, were often unable to assert their authority fully and were vulnerable to the shifting currents of political instability. Their reigns are paradoxical because they represent the dual nature of royal power: the divine right to rule and the human limitations that come with youth and inexperience. The legacy of these child pharaohs reminds us that while monarchs may be born into power, the true test of their reign often lies in their ability to navigate the complex political landscapes of their time. Despite the power that comes with the throne, the absence of maturity and the influence of others may shape the fate of a kingdom. These child rulers, in their limited time on the throne, left behind legacies shaped by the people around them, rather than by their own decisions. In the end, they stand as symbols of both the power and the fragility of the monarchy, ruled by divine right, but ruled by the whims of those who wielded the true power behind the throne. You stand at the edge of a cold northern hall where thick wooden beams rise like the ribs of some long-dead beast. The air smells of smoke and salt, the echo of waves crashing just beyond the stone walls. Inside, long tables are empty now, cups overturned, food left half-eaten, and at the far end, seated upon a throne carved from blackened oak, is a man whose eyes do not see. His gaze is fixed forward, empty yet full of something quieter than sight: memory, power, fear. This is the blind Viking ruler. His name was Harald Sigurdsson, remembered across the sagas as Harald Hardrada. Though before his final battles, before his march on England, there lived another Harald, Harald the Blind. A quieter figure in Viking history, spoken of not in blood-soaked poetry but in hushed recitations over winter fires. His story is less written than woven into the background of larger myths. Historians debate the exact details, but throughout Norse tradition, blind rulers held a strange paradoxical place: sightless, yet called seers, weak in body, yet stronger than those around them. Harald is remembered as a jarl, less than a king, more than a lord, who ruled from within the darkened halls of Bergen, Norway, sometime around the early 11th century. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called authority through limitation. Studies in human perception show that when a leader lacks one ability, like sight, followers often amplify their other qualities in imagination, wisdom, foresight, patience. The blind Viking became not just a ruler, but a living oracle. Imagine now walking through that hall, hearing his voice, low, steady, giving orders as though he sees through the wooden walls themselves, servants and warriors moving in silence, afraid to question, afraid to stare too long at those empty eyes. There's another layer: controlled vulnerability paradox. Cognitive psychologists studying leadership dynamics find that when a figure openly displays a vulnerability, blindness, injury, old age, it can paradoxically strengthen their authority. Harald's blindness wasn't hidden, it became part of his legend. According to surviving fragments of saga and local lore, Harald the Blind ruled not through raiding or conquest, but through quiet manipulation of alliances. Tribes and jarls came to him not for battle orders, but for judgment. His hall became known as the place of the sightless law. Now reflect inward. How many parts of your own life have been shaped by quiet strengths others assigned to you, not because you claimed them, but because of a perceived weakness? Psychologists call this shadow authority bias. The mind fills silence with imagined power. The paradox deepens when considering how Viking society normally valued physical strength above all. The image of the perfect Norseman was tall, loud, battle-scarred. Yet Harald broke that loop. His very stillness became strategy. Imagine again standing beside him in a colder moment, snow falling through cracks in the wooden roof. his hand resting on a carved staff, listening as two warriors argue before him. He speaks only once, and both fall silent. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still picture Vikings only as raiders, not rulers. That's the recursive warrior effect. Cultures remembered more for their noise than for their silences. There's also the collective memory blind spot. Historians note how blind rulers appear across multiple ancient cultures, yet are rarely emphasized in official chronicles. Eye blindness becomes a metaphor too complex to easily summarize. Think now about your own quiet blind spots, the parts of yourself you ignore because they don't fit the story you tell. Moments where silence, pause, or limitation became the real center of your strength. The quiet trap becomes clear. Harald's blindness was never his weakness. It was the reason his hall remained standing long after louder kings fell. Imagine one final moment standing at the hall's open door as dawn breaks. The snow-covered mountains turning gold, Harald still seated, eyes unseeing, yet aware of everything around him. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet halls of memory and belief, ask yourself, if even history's sharpest rulers once sat in darkness rather than light, how many of your own quiet visions are waiting not to be seen, but simply to be trusted? Even with your eyes closed, you stand before the gates of a palace hidden deep within endless pine forests, its roofs tiled in quiet green, its walls white as paper, its silence absolute. No guards shout, no banners wave, only the sound of the wind moving through carefully raked stone gardens. Inside, down long wooden corridors that smell of cedar and ink, sits a figure dressed in layered silks, an emperor, but he does not speak, he does not rule. He only sits. This is the silent emperor of Japan. His name was Emperor Antoku, born in 1178, crowned while still a child. But more than his age or his title, it is the silence around him that lingers through history. A figure caught not in power, but in a web of ceremony so intricate, so recursive, it became its own form of stillness. In Japan's Heian and early Kamakura periods, the imperial family was often both the center of the world and completely removed from it. Real power lay with shoguns, with regents, with warrior clans like the Taira and Minamoto. The emperor became a figurehead, silent, ritual-bound, trapped in a golden cage of endless customs. Psychologists studying organizational behavior call this symbolic leadership entrapment. When a leader's role becomes purely symbolic, maintaining appearance replaces action. Emperor Antoku's reign embodied this paradox perfectly. Crowned as a baby, held aloft by warriors, carried from palace to palace as battles raged around him, all without ever issuing a command of his own. Imagine now standing inside one of those palaces. The tatami mats creak underfoot. Scrolls hang on the walls depicting dragons and mountains. And there, seated behind a screen of rice paper, Antoku waits. His face calm, his hands folded, the silence so heavy it feels like stone. There's another layer, collective ritual inertia. Cognitive scientists studying group behavior show that when systems become too dependent on ritual, they resist change even in the face of collapse. Antoku's court continued to perform ancient ceremonies as enemy armies closed in around them, as if the rituals themselves could hold back the tide. Now reflect inward. How many quiet rituals in your own life continue not because they serve you, but because they have simply always been there? Psychologists call this habitual looping. Patterns repeated for so long they outlast the reason they began. The paradox deepens with Antoku's death. At age 6, carried by his grandmother during the final battle of the Genpei War, Antoku was taken to sea, and when defeat was certain, both he and the imperial regalia, the sacred sword, jewel, and mirror were cast into the waves. The child emperor drowned silently, becoming part of Japan's national myth. Imagine again standing at the edge of that sea, watching ripples fade into quiet, a boy emperor lost not in blood or conquest, but in silence and water. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still picture emperors as rulers with loud voices and armies. That's the recursive authority effect. Societies remember leaders for their noise even when their greatest power was in stillness. There's also historical echo flattening. Over centuries, Antoku's story has been folded into legend. Some say he became a sea spirit, others that his regalia still waits beneath the waves. Think now about your own quiet crowns. The roles or titles you carry that no longer require action, only presence. Family expectations, social labels, silent responsibilities. The quiet trap becomes clear. Antoku was never meant to command. His silence was not failure. It was the role assigned to him from birth. Imagine one final moment standing again in that pine forest as dusk falls. The palace behind you hidden once more in shadow and stone. No voice calls out. No banner waves. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet palaces of thought, walking corridors both real and imagined, ask yourself, if even history sits highest thrones can be shaped more by silence than command, how many of your own quiet titles are waiting not to be spoken, but simply to be carried with grace, until the tide carries them quietly away? The story of King Ludwig II of Bavaria, often known as the Drunk King or the Fairy Tale King, is one of the most tragic and paradoxical tales of monarchy in European history. Famous for his eccentricity, his love of lavish art, and his obsession with building castles, Ludwig II's reign is often overshadowed by rumors of his mental instability, including his supposed indulgence in alcohol and his increasingly erratic behavior. However, the reality of Ludwig's life and reign was far more complex. His image as a drunk king was a product of both his personal vulnerabilities and the political climate of his time, and his legacy as a monarch remains both enigmatic and enduring. Born in 1845, Ludwig became King of Bavaria at the age of 18 following the death of his father, King Maximilian II. From the outset, Ludwig's reign was marked by his disinterest in state affairs and his deep isolation from the realities of ruling. Unlike his father, who was a more traditional ruler with a strong interest in statecraft, Ludwig seemed uninterested in the daily grind of politics, preferring instead to retreat into his private world of artistic creation. He was particularly enamored with the works of Richard Wagner, the famed composer, and his obsession with Wagner's music and themes deeply influenced Ludwig's vision of monarchy and his projects. It was through his admiration for Wagner's operas that Ludwig developed his idealized vision of medieval chivalry and fairy tale kingdoms, which led him to commission some of the most famous castles in Europe, including the Neuschwanstein Castle, an iconic symbol of Bavarian and German Romanticism. Ludwig's disinterest in the practical matters of governance, combined with his fascination with art, music, and idealized forms of monarchy, began to worry those around him. As his reign progressed, Ludwig became more and more reclusive, his behavior became erratic, and he was perceived as increasingly detached from reality. Allegedly, Ludwig began to indulge in excessive alcohol consumption, with many contemporaries attributing his increasing mood swings and eccentric behavior to his drinking habits. Whether these reports of alcoholism are accurate or the result of his strained mental health is difficult to ascertain, but they played a significant role in shaping the public's perception of Ludwig as the drunk king. However, it is important to recognize that Ludwig's eccentricities were not purely a result of drinking. His emotional and mental health had been a subject of concern for years, with many speculating that he suffered from severe depression, isolation, and possibly even a form of schizophrenia. Ludwig's reclusiveness, combined with his inability to connect with his court and his subjects, made him a vulnerable figure in the eyes of the political elites. His refusal to marry and produce an heir, his secretive behavior, and his obsession with his fantastical building projects only deepened the sense of mystery that surrounded him. Despite his increasing isolation, Ludwig remained an immensely popular figure in Bavaria, especially due to his support of the arts and his ambitious castle projects. Neuschwanstein Castle in particular became a symbol of Bavarian pride and a testament to Ludwig's vision of a fairy tale kingdom. His other grand building projects, including Linderhof Palace and Herrenchiemsee Palace, reflected his desire to create an idealized world of beauty and grandeur, disconnected from the harsh political realities of his time. These castles, built in remote locations, were places where Ludwig could escape from the pressures of the world and live out his fantasies of medieval knights, royal grandeur, and Wagnerian opera. However, Ludwig's personal world began to crumble as his financial expenditures on these projects strained Bavaria's economy. The government, led by Ludwig's ministers, became increasingly frustrated with his extravagance, and his inability to manage the state's finances became a major point of contention. In 1886, a group of his advisors, fearing for the stability of the kingdom, declared Ludwig mentally unfit to rule and forcibly deposed him. He was placed under the care of a psychiatrist, Dr. Gudden, and confined to Berg Castle. Just days after his deposition, Ludwig was found dead in mysterious circumstances, along with Dr. Gudden, whose death remains as much a mystery as the king's own. Some speculate that Ludwig was murdered to prevent him from reclaiming the throne, while others believe that his death was the result of suicide. The exact cause of his death has never been conclusively determined, leaving his final moments shrouded in intrigue. Ludwig's legacy as a monarch is thus marked by the paradox of his apparent failure as a ruler, paired with his enduring impact on culture and architecture. While his reign was largely ineffective in terms of political leadership, his castles and his patronage of the arts have become part of the cultural fabric of Bavaria and Germany. Neuschwanstein Castle, often cited as one of the most beautiful castles in the world, was an inspiration for Disney's Sleeping Beauty Castle, and remains a symbol of Ludwig's vision of an idealized romantic world. His contributions to the arts and his vision for Bavaria as a cultural hub have ensured that his memory has lived on, even though his rule was marked by personal isolation, political instability, and the perception of an unreliable and even irresponsible ruler. The Drunk King label, while largely a product of later myth-making and sensationalism, serves as a reflection of how Ludwig's behavior was misunderstood by his contemporaries and by future generations. His eccentricities, though real, were tied to his emotional distress, his retreat from the responsibilities of governance, and his obsession with creating an escape from the pressures of reality. The paradox of Ludwig II lies in the tension between his artistic and cultural contributions and his personal inability to navigate the political realities of his time. The Drunk King was not merely a ruler undone by his drinking, but a monarch whose internal struggles, personal demons, and artistic aspirations created a tragic and fascinating figure in history. In the end, Ludwig's life and reign raise fundamental questions about the nature of kingship. How much responsibility should a monarch take for the state they rule? How much should a ruler's personal desires and obsessions influence their decisions for the greater good? Ludwig II's life answers these questions in stark tragic terms, revealing the personal cost of absolute power and the disconnection that can arise between a ruler and their realm. His legacy, however, remains one of intrigue and fascination, marked by the beautiful yet melancholic castles that still stand as testament to his visionary if troubled reign. You stand in a stone square surrounded by half-timbered buildings, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and sweat.
But something's wrong.
The people here aren't shouting or walking quietly to market.
They're dancing.
Dozens of them spinning endlessly, faces pale, feet bleeding through worn leather shoes. At the center of it all stands a woman, tall, regal, arms outstretched as if leading an invisible orchestra, her eyes wide open, her mouth caught between a smile and a scream. This is the dancing plague queen. The year was 1518 and the place was Strasbourg, a city in the Holy Roman Empire. Historical records confirm what sounds impossible. Over 400 people suddenly began dancing in the streets. Not for minutes, not for hours, for days, some for weeks. Many collapsed from exhaustion, some reportedly died. And though no official monarch ruled this strange outbreak, history remembers one figure at its center, Frau Trophea, the woman who started it all. It began quietly. On a hot July morning, Frau Trophy stepped into the street, and began to dance. At first, it seemed like an eccentric moment. But she didn't stop. Neighbors gathered. By the second day, more had joined her. By the end of the week, dozens spun, and stamped in a frenzy no one could explain. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called mass psychogenic illness. Cognitive scientists studying crowd behavior show that stress, fear, and social pressure can trigger real physical symptoms across entire groups: illness, laughter, even uncontrollable movement. Imagine now standing beside Frau Trophia, not as an observer, but as a participant. Your own feet begin to move without command, your heartbeat racing. The rhythm not in the music, there is none, but in something deeper, primal. There's another layer: collective ritual disorder. In societies facing extreme hardship, drought, famine, plague, ritual behaviors emerge unconsciously as a form of communal control. Dancing until collapse may seem irrational, but for those trapped in it, it was a loop they couldn't break. Strasbourg in 1518 was facing exactly such conditions: crop failures, disease, political instability. Historians suggest the dancing plague may have been a mass response to unbearable tension, a way for the body to express what words could not. Now reflect inward. How many quiet movements in your own life repeat not because you chose them, but because stress has pushed you into unconscious loops? Psychologists call this patterned stress behavior, rituals that emerge when the mind has no other outlet. The paradox deepens with the figure of the dancing plague queen herself. Some sources suggest Frau Trophée had no title, no real leadership role, yet her image endures. The first dancer, the one who began the storm. Imagine again watching her now, spinning in the middle of the square as rain begins to fall, her feet red with blood, her face pale but still moving. Even now, knowing the quieter truths, part of you may still picture this as madness alone. That's the recursive chaos effect, when disorder is remembered as meaningless even when it held hidden structure. There lived a curious boy named Oliver. Over the centuries, the story of Strasbourg's dancing plague was folded into legends of witches, spirits, and cursed music. The real cause became less important than the enduring image. Think now about your own dancing plagues, habits, or fears that began long ago for reasons you no longer remember, but which continue all the same. The quiet trap becomes clear. What begins as expression can become entrapment, movement without end. Historical records show that Strasbourg's authorities tried everything to stop the plague. Music, priests, isolation. But nothing worked until the dancers themselves simply stopped. One by one, the square emptied. Silence returned. Frau Trophia disappeared from the record as if she had never existed at all. Imagine one final moment standing in that same square as dawn breaks, long after the last footstep has faded. Hills. The cobblestones stained dark, the air still, and in the silence, the memory of music that was never really played. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet squares of thought, ask yourself, if even history's strangest loops began not with chaos but with quiet need, how many of your own unbroken dances are waiting not for someone to stop you, but simply for you to notice that the music was never really there at all? You stand in the middle of a cold stone courtyard. Rain falls in slow, deliberate sheets, tapping against slate roofs and iron gates. Around you rise the walls of a castle, both grand and strangely empty, its towers leaning slightly, its banners worn thin by wind. And from a doorway lit by torchlight steps a man, cloaked in royal purple, crowned with gold, but bent, his spine curved, his gait uneven, his face pale, his expression unreadable. This is Charles VIII of France, known not simply as king, but as the Hunchback King. Charles VIII ruled France from 1483 to 1498, ascending the throne as a child, but history remembers him less for his politics and more for his shape. Born with multiple physical deformities, a pronounced hunchback, a large head, asymmetrical features, Charles became a figure surrounded by both silence and contradiction. In the royal courts of late medieval Europe, appearance was tied to divine right. Kings were meant to look strong, tall, flawless. Charles defied this expectation, yet he wore the crown all the same. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called visual authority bias. Cognitive studies show that humans instinctively associate leadership with certain physical traits: height, symmetry, clarity of movement. When a leader lacks these traits, societies respond in complex, often contradictory ways, fearing weakness, while also assigning mysterious strength. Imagine now standing beside Charles VIII in one of his quieter moments, not at war but in a private chamber, maps spread before him, audit visors waiting silently, his hand shaking slightly as he places a chess piece, his back aching from its endless curve. There's another layer: compensatory myth formation. Psychologists studying royal history find that when a ruler's body defies expected norms, legends grow around them to fill the gap. Charles's hunchback became not just a deformity, but a symbol. Stories whispered through Paris that he had hidden knowledge, secret strength, that his twisted spine mirrored the twisting paths of politics. Now reflect inward. How many parts of your own life have been shaped by things you cannot control? Body, appearance, voice, quiet features that others see before they hear you. Psychologists call this identity framing bias. The paradox deepens with Charles's reign. Despite his physical condition, he launched one of the most ambitious military campaigns of his time, the Italian Wars, marching armies into Italy, capturing Naples, defying expectations. Imagine again walking beside him through a rain-soaked battlefield, soldiers staring not at his back, but at the standard he carries forward. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still picture medieval kings as flawless statues rather than bent figures. That's the recursive perfection loop. Once ideal images are created, real variations become invisible. There's also collective memory distortion. Over centuries, Charles VIII's story was folded into myths of cursed bloodlines and royal tragedies, his actual achievements often overshadowed by his shape. Think now about your own quiet achievements, things you've done that others overlook because they are too focused on something else. Appearance, accent, posture. The quiet trap becomes clear. Charles VIII ruled not despite his hunchback but through it. His body's curve became part of France's path. His death came suddenly. In 1498, while walking through his castle in Amboise, Charles struck his head on a low doorway and collapsed. A simple human accident. Yet even this was folded into myth. A king too bent to see the path ahead, undone not by battle but by the very walls of his own home. Imagine one final moment standing in that hallway as the rain outside slows, the castle growing quieter, the king's footsteps silenced at last, but his shape, his echoes still present in the stones. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet halls of memory and thought, ask yourself, if even history's most visible imperfections could become sources of unseen strength, how many of your own quiet curves are waiting not to be hidden, but simply to be carried? Like a crown resting lightly on a bent head, you stand beneath the great domes of Topkapi Palace, where marble floors shine like glass and golden filigree decorates every archway. Outside, the city of Istanbul stretches wide, its skyline sharp with minarets and towers. But here inside the palace there is silence. No court in session, no soldiers on parade. Instead, behind a heavy curtain of silk and shadow, someone sits. A figure unseen by all but a few, a man called Sultan, yet one without a voice in public life. This is the Shadow Sultan of the Ottomans. His name was Mustafa Daf, a ruler whose story exists not in declarations or conquests, but in hushed whispers. Mustafa Daf became Sultan twice, once in 1617 and again in 1622. Both times his reign was defined by invisibility. Officially, he held the title of the most powerful man in the empire. In reality, he spent most of his life locked in the kafes, the cage. The kafes was a gilded prison within Topkapi Palace, a set of rooms where princes were confined to prevent rebellions, Sultan Mustafa had lived there for years before ascending the throne, and by the time he was crowned, the damage was done. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called sensory deprivation regression. Studies show that long periods of enforced silence and isolation can cause not only mental instability but a return to childlike behavior. Mustafa I was known to speak in broken phrases, laugh at odd times, and disappear into rooms for hours without explanation. Imagine now standing in the cafes yourself, sunlight filtered through latticed screens, the quiet hum of distant music too faint to follow, a life measured not in days but in shadows. There's another layer, symbolic authority with cognitive absence. Psychologists studying power structures find that even when a leader is mentally or physically absent, the system around them often continues unchanged, advisors, courtiers, and generals acting in their name. During Mustafa's reign, real control passed to his mother, Kuzem Sultan, and to the Grand Viziers. Orders were issued, wars fought, taxes collected. But the Sultan himself remained a shadow behind curtains and screens. Now reflect inward. How many times in your own life have you held a title or role yet felt absent from it? Psychologists call this hollow role phenomenon, carrying the name but not the action. The paradox deepens with how Ottoman history remembers Mustafa I, not as a madman but as a necessity. His first reign began because his cousin Sultan Ahmed I died unexpectedly. His second reign followed the assassination of Sultan Osman II. Mustafa became a placeholder king not for his own sake but because the empire needed a body to fill the throne. Imagine again standing in the divan, the imperial council chamber, curtains drawn, decisions made in whispers, and behind them all a figure unseen but ever present, the shadow sultan. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still imagine Ottoman sultans as absolute rulers commanding armies and building mosques. That's the recursive authority loop, power structures remembered for their visible peaks while the shadows beneath them are forgotten. There's also collective memory pruning. Historians often simplify dynastic records, trimming away figures like Mustafa I, who do not fit the expected pattern of strong, decisive leadership. Think now about your own quiet titles, the names and roles you carry in family, work, or memory that may no longer reflect what you truly do or feel. The quiet trap becomes clear. Sultan Mustafa's rule existed not through presence but through absence. His power was the shape of a hand pressed against silk, never fully seen. In 1623, after his final removal from power, Mustafa was returned to the cafes where he lived until his death. Years passed in silence, forgotten by most outside the palace walls. Imagine one final moment standing at the edge of the cafes as dawn breaks, into light filtering through the screens in golden patterns. The halls quiet, the empire moving onward, never pausing to look back. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet palaces of thought, ask yourself, if even history says greatest thrones can be ruled more by shadows than by hands, if even history says greatest thrones can be ruled more by shadows than by hands, if even history says greatest thrones can be ruled more by shadows than by hands, how many of your own quiet roles are waiting not to be abandoned, but simply to be stepped out from, leaving behind only the echo of a name whispered through silk and stone? You stand in a frozen forest where tall pines rise like black spires against a sky turned pale by winter. Snow falls in soft spirals, covering everything in silence. Ahead of you, between two birch trees, a figure appears, a man wrapped in fur, crowned not with gold but with ice and hunger. His eyes sharp like a wolf's, watching everything and trusting no one. This is the Wolf King of Sweden. His name was Charles V. Crowned in 1660 King of Sweden at the age of just 5 years old, Charles V would become remembered not for opulence or grand parades, but for something colder, his absolute calculating control and the feral isolation that shaped his reign. While other kings ruled from open courts filled with music and wine, Charles V turned inward. He hunted not only animals but his own council members, advisors replaced, Nobles stripped of power, his court became as silent as the forests outside Stockholm. Historians call him the architect of Swedish absolutism. But beneath that political legacy, quieter stories ripple like hidden rivers. Charles walking alone through winter forests at midnight, armed with only a bow and a knife, refusing servants, avoiding feasts, eating alone in stone-walled rooms, lit by a single candle. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called isolation-induced control bias. Cognitive studies show that individuals who experience early abandonment or sudden responsibility often develop hyper-focused self-reliance, trusting only themselves, controlling everything, from strategy to silence. Imagine now standing in his hunting lodge. Frost clings to wooden beams. Charles sits by a fire, sharpening a blade that gleams like ice under firelight. No crown on his head, no smile on his face. There was another layer, predator emulation syndrome. Psychologists studying leadership behaviors note that some rulers adopt the traits of apex predators not for show but as survival mechanisms. Charles was called the Wolf King by both allies and enemies. His silence wasn't just personal, it became strategy. During his reign, Sweden faced endless external threats. Denmark, Russia, internal rebellion. But Charles didn't gather armies in public squares. He built what historians call the invisible state, a system of power so tightly controlled, so centrally bound to his own silent commands, that it left no space for weakness. Now reflect inward. How many of your own habits have become wolf-like, quiet,
isolated,
focused not on showing strength, but on making sure no one sees the places where strength might falter?
Psychologists call this adaptive predator behavior.
The paradox deepens when considering how Sweden itself changed. Charles VII took a country weakened by debt and division and rebuilt it into one of Europe's most efficient states. Tax systems, military reforms, all done quietly, methodically, through paper, not parades. Imagine again walking through his castle now. No grand ballrooms, only narrow corridors lined with hunting trophies and maps marked in dark ink. A kingdom ruled not by speeches but by quiet steps through snow and silence. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still imagine Swedish kings as elaborate figures in courtly dress. That's the recursive monarch loop. History remembering only its loudest rulers, not its quietest predators. There's also the collective memory mask. Charles VIII is often overshadowed by his son Charles VIII, the more famous warrior king. But behind every warrior is a wolf who built the path. Think now about your own quiet kingdoms, things you maintain not through noise but through silent, relentless control, finances, relationships, routines. The quiet trap becomes clear. Charles XI ruled through silence so complete that even his own legacy was half erased behind the louder stories of others. In 1697, Charles Adolphe died at age 41. His reign was mourned not with grand ceremonies, but with a quiet funeral. His body laid to rest in Ridderholm Church, beneath stone carved as plain as the man himself had lived. Imagine one final moment standing in the snow outside that church as night falls. The city behind you glowing faintly, and somewhere in the dark forest beyond, the echo of footsteps, the Wolf King still walking. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet woods of memory and thought, ask yourself, if even history's fiercest rulers carried their crowns more like wolves than like kings, how many of your own quiet hunts are waiting not to be shared, but simply to be walked alone, one silent step at a time, until the snow covers all tracks, and only the forest remembers? You stand in a narrow stone hallway lit by flickering torchlight. The air smells of cold iron and damp stone. Ahead of you stands a door made of thick oak, bolted from the outside, and beyond it silence. No voices, no footsteps, only the quiet breath of someone who should not exist. Behind that door is a man who cannot be named, a man who has no face. This is the masked man of France. You may have heard the legend, The Man in the Iron Mask, a prisoner held in secret by the order of French kings. But as you stand there now, listening, a quieter thought begins to surface. What if the mask wasn't just about hiding a man's identity? What if it was about something deeper, about hiding the possibility that some truths must never fully be seen? Historically, the masked man was real. Records show a prisoner held in multiple French prisons, including the Bastille between the late 1600s and early 1700s. He was always kept masked, sometimes iron, sometimes velvet, always covering his face. His guards were ordered not to speak to him. His name never written in public documents. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called enforced anonymity conditioning. Cognitive scientists studying social systems show that when individuals are forced into absolute invisibility, no name, no face, their very existence becomes myth rather than memory. Imagine now standing outside his cell, listening. Not for words, but for the quiet sound of breath behind metal, the mask not just sealing his face, but erasing it from history. There's another layer, symbolic erasure syndrome. Psychologists note that when societies face truths too dangerous or painful, they don't always destroy them. Sometimes they lock them away in silence, hidden but alive. The masked man became not just a person, but a placeholder for a secret too large to name. Speculation surrounded his identity. Was he the illegitimate brother of King Louis XIV, a disgraced noble, a political threat? Voltaire and Alexandre Dumas turned him into legend, but even royal records remain vague. Now reflect inward. How many parts of yourself have been masked, not from others, but from your own memory?
Psychologists call this selective identity veiling.
Hiding truths behind quiet rituals until even you forget they were ever there. The paradox deepens when considering why he was kept alive. If he was truly dangerous, why not execute him? The answer may lie in another loop: controlled myth retention. Societies sometimes keep their shadows close, containing them, not erasing them entirely. Imagine again walking through that prison late at night, guards asleep, the sound of keys turning slowly. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still imagine the masked man as pure fiction. That's the recursive myth loop. Once a figure becomes legend, their reality grows quieter than their shadow. There's also cultural memory amplification. Over centuries, the story was folded into books, films, art, growing larger with each retelling. Think now about your own hidden names. Parts of yourself you've locked away behind habits, silence, or belief. The quiet trap becomes clear. The masked man was never just about secrecy. He was about the need to carry unspeakable things quietly, generation after generation. In 1703, the masked man died in the Bastille. His burial was quiet, his name marked only as unknown. Yet his story lived on. Imagine one final moment standing by his grave as rain falls softly. No stone, no name, only the memory of breath behind iron. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet prisons of memory and thought, ask yourself, if even history's deepest secrets were shaped more by silence than by truth, how many of your own quiet masks are waiting not to be removed, but simply to be acknowledged as part of who you are? Behind every locked door in your mind, you stand before the crumbling walls of a castle set high on a hill, its stones stained dark by centuries of rain and whispered stories. The sky above glows red with the last light of sunset, and somewhere within those walls, behind iron gates and shuttered windows, footsteps echo, slow, measured. A woman moves through the hallways, dressed in black and red, her hands pale as marble, her eyes cold as frozen rivers. This is Erzsébet Báthory, the Blood Countess of Hungary. History remembers her name wrapped in legend, the woman who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth, a countess more feared than any warlord. Yet, as with all things that linger so long in shadow, the truth beneath her story is quieter, stranger, harder to hold. Born in 1560 into one of the most powerful noble families in Hungary, Erzsébet was educated, wealthy, and politically influential. But by the early 1600s, she had become the center of one of the darkest scandals in European history. Servants began disappearing. Peasants whispered of girls taken to the castle never to return. And when royal investigators finally searched her home, what they found blurred the line between fact and nightmare. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called atrocity magnification bias. When society encounters a figure who breaks its moral limits, especially a woman in power, every detail becomes amplified. True crimes twist into myth. Imagine now standing in her castle corridors. The scent of cold stone and dried herbs fills the air. Candles flicker along the walls. And somewhere ahead, that slow echoing step continues, always just out of sight. Official records from her trial list hundreds of alleged victims, yet modern historians argue many details were exaggerated, possibly for political reasons. Erzsébet's wealth and land made her a threat to rivals. Her crimes, though real, may have been expanded into legend to justify her downfall. There's another layer: gendered power mythology. Psychologists studying historical memory find that powerful women are often remembered not for their governance or achievements, but through lenses of fear and fascination. Witch, seductress, monster. Now reflect inward. How many quiet parts of your own story have been shaped not by your actions but by how others chose to see you? Psychologists call this projected identity framing. The paradox deepens with Erzsébet's punishment. She was never executed. Instead, she was walled up inside her own castle, placed under house arrest for the rest of her life. One window, one slot for food, years spent alone, silent, locked within stone. Imagine again standing outside that final room. No screams, no footsteps now, only the slow drip of rain on the windowsill. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still picture her bathing in blood. That's the recursive horror loop. Once fear takes root in memory, it repeats itself beyond fact. There's also collective echo distortion. Erzsébet Bathory's name has echoed into books, films, games, her image detached from history, surviving as pure symbol. Think now about your own internal castles, places in your mind built from stories others told about you rather than truths you chose yourself. The quiet trap becomes clear. Sometimes the prison is not built from stone, but from memory itself. Erzsébet Bathory died in 1614, still locked within her tower. Her body was buried in a village church, then quietly moved, her final resting place unknown. Imagine one final moment standing beneath her castle as dawn rises. The hill shrouded in mist. No footsteps now, no echoes, only the cold wind carrying the last whispers of her name. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet halls of memory and belief, ask yourself, if even history's darkest figures were shaped more by myth than truth, how many of your own quiet shadows are waiting not to haunt you, but simply to be seen clearly? Through the quiet cracks in the castle walls, you stand in a palace of ice and stone, its windows frosted over, its walls echoing with the weight of empire. The chandeliers drip with cold light, candles burning low as shadows twist along marble floors. And in the grandest hall beneath a ceiling painted with stars, a figure sits on a silver throne. His robe is heavy with fur, his crown gleams, but what fills the room is not command. It's laughter, low, endless, sharp as winter wind. This is Paul of Russia, the laughing Tsar. Born in 1754, Paul I ruled as Emperor of Russia from 1796 until his assassination in 1801. His reign was brief but unforgettable, not for wars or treaties but for unpredictability. Where his mother, Catherine the Great, had ruled with cold calculation, Paul brought something stranger to the throne: erratic decrees, midnight orders, and an almost constant, unsettling laugh. Historians describe Paul's behavior as oscillating between brilliance and madness. One moment drafting reforms, The next, issuing laws so absurd his court barely knew how to respond. Banning round hats, forbidding carriages with certain decorations, changing military uniforms overnight. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called authority disinhibition syndrome. Studies show that individuals placed suddenly into absolute power, especially after long periods of suppression, may exhibit wild swings in behavior, both as a form of release and as a means of testing loyalty. Imagine now standing beside him, not during an official audience but in one of his night walks, wandering through St. Petersburg's icy streets disguised as a common man, laughing quietly to himself, asking strangers absurd questions. There's another layer, the unstable sovereign effect. Psychologists observing leadership history note that when a ruler behaves unpredictably, those beneath them often respond with exaggerated obedience, mirroring the instability in their own decisions. Under Paul, the Russian court became a place of constant tension. Guards waited each day for new orders that might undo the ones given the night before. Ministers kept extra sets of clothes, unsure which uniform would be allowed that week. Now reflect inward. How many patterns in your own life mirror this quiet instability, habits that shift without warning, rules you set for yourself only to break the next day? Psychologists call this self-contradiction bias. The paradox deepens when considering why Paul laughed. Accounts suggest it wasn't joy but control. His laughter kept others off balance. By laughing in the face of danger, criticism, even logic, he held the upper hand. Imagine again standing in his council room, maps laid out across the table, generals waiting, and Paul seated in silence until a sudden sharp laugh breaks the stillness. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still picture Russian tsars as silent, grim figures. That's the recursive authority mask history often smooths over the stranger faces of power. There's also collective memory simplification. Hitler's reign is often summarized as a failure or a brief madness, forgetting the quieter systems he put in place: military discipline reforms, attempts at law codification. Think now about your own internal rulers, the parts of yourself that set rules, only to laugh at them later. The quiet kings and queens in your mind who contradict themselves. The quiet trap becomes clear. Paul's laughter wasn't weakness. It was armor. The sound of a man both trapped and freed by the crown on his head. His end came suddenly. In 1801, nobles fearing his instability plotted his assassination. Paul was strangled in his own bedroom, his final breath silent beneath the weight of his own unpredictable reign. Imagine one final moment standing outside St. Michael's Castle as dawn breaks, frost sparkling on its walls. Inside, the throne sits empty, but in the silence the faintest echo of laughter remains. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet palaces of thought, ask yourself, if even history's loudest rulers masked their fear with laughter, how many of your own quiet rules are waiting not to be broken, but simply to be understood? One quiet laugh at a time, echoing through halls no one else can see. You stand before a mountain that is not a mountain, its sides carved smooth, its top shaped like a throne, and rising from its heart is a city made of stone, not living stone, but frozen stone. Temples, statues, walls as tall as fortresses, yet silent as tombs. At the center of it all stands a figure, so still he might be mistaken for a statue himself, draped in layered silk, crowned with a diadem of jade and gold, eyes closed, breath shallow. This is King Bodopaya of Burma, the Stone King. Bodopaya ruled the Konbaung dynasty from 1782 to 1819. His name stretches long across Burmese history, yet beneath the surface of conquests and reforms lies something quieter, stranger. Bodopaya was obsessed not just with ruling but with building things so large, so permanent, they would outlive all memory of him. His greatest project was the Mingun Patadaji, a stupa meant to be the largest in the world. It was never completed. What stands today is a colossal slab of stone, cracked by earthquakes, abandoned long before it reached its planned height. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called monumental immortality loop. Cognitive studies show that rulers facing the reality of mortality often attempt to leave behind structures rather than words, massive, immovable symbols of their existence. Imagine now standing beside Bodopaya as he oversees construction. Workers chisel stone. Dust fills the air, but the king says nothing. He watches with eyes as still as the mountains, his face as unreadable as the cliffs around him. There is another layer: silent megalomania syndrome. Psychologists studying leadership behavior note that some rulers avoid the noise of court life, focusing instead on quiet, obsessive projects that consume years, sometimes decades. Bodopaya wasn't known for grand speeches. His court described him as a man of few words, more interested in astrology and architecture than daily governance. Yet behind that silence grew one of the largest structures ever attempted by human hands. Now reflect inward. How many quiet monuments have you begun in your own life? Not buildings, but routines, habits, long-term projects, started as a way to outlive yourself. Psychologists call this symbolic continuity behavior. The paradox deepens with the unfinished nature of Mingun. Earthquakes in 1839 split the stupa. The cracks remain today, but Bodopaya never saw it completed. Some say he ordered work to stop after hearing an astrologer predict its completion would mark his death. Imagine again standing at the foot of that cracked monument, your hand resting against stone warmed by the sun, feeling not just its size but its silence. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still think of kings only as men of words and battles. That's the recursive legacy loop. History recording the loudest victories, not the quietest obsessions. There's also collective memory fragmentation. Bodopaya is remembered in fragments, part tyrant, part visionary, part ghost. Think now about your own unfinished monuments, the things you once believed would last forever, now half-built or forgotten. The quiet trap becomes clear. Bodopaya's stupa was meant to outlast empires. Instead, its cracks became its legacy. Not perfection, but fracture. He died in 1819, leaving behind not a completed monument, but a stone husk, a city-sized shadow. Imagine one final moment standing beneath the cracked stupa as dawn breaks, furge nesting in its broken walls, the river below moving as slowly as thought. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet cities of stone and memory, ask yourself, if even history's grandest monuments can be defined more by their unfinished edges than by their size, how many of your own quiet legacies are waiting not to be completed, but simply to be seen as beautiful, precisely because they are still in progress, still unfinished, still your own? You stand at the edge of a city made of sand and gold. The sun burns low in the sky, turning the horizon into molten bronze. All around you rise towers carved from mud brick, shimmering with dust, their surfaces polished smooth by centuries of wind. Markets stretch in every direction, silks, spices, scrolls, and at the center of it all, surrounded by guards draped in crimson cloth, rides a man on horseback. His robes sparkle with gold dust, coins fall from his hands like rain. This is Mansa Musa, the Golden King of Mali. History remembers Mansa Musa as the wealthiest man to ever live. His name echoes through time not just because of his conquests or palaces, but because of the sheer scale of his fortune. Gold mines stretching for miles, caravans carrying wealth across the Sahara. His famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 became legend, a journey so lavish it reportedly destabilized entire economies along his path. But beneath the gleam of gold lies a quieter, stranger truth. Mansa Musa's wealth was not only real, it became myth. The line between fact and legend blurred until the man himself became as much a symbol as a ruler. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called perceived infinite resource illusion. Cognitive studies show that when wealth reaches a scale beyond ordinary comprehension, the human mind stops calculating and starts imagining, turning numbers into endless loops. Imagine now walking beside his caravan, camels loaded with gold ingots, servants carrying trays piled with coins, yet Mansa Musa says little, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his power silent, his wealth moving like wind. There's another layer, quiet abundance syndrome. Psychologists studying historical leadership note that rulers with immense resources often become paradoxically quieter, withdrawing from public life into private halls filled not with people but with treasure. Mansa Musa's court in Timbuktu was not only a center of trade but of learning, libraries filled with manuscripts. Scholars from across the Islamic world gathered in silence, writing beneath lamp-lit halls while the markets outside rang with the clink of gold. Now reflect inward. How many treasures in your own life have grown so familiar they've become silent? Not coins but habits, skills, knowledge, things you once valued loudly, but now carry quietly. Psychologists call this value silence bias. The paradox deepens when considering the aftershocks of Musa's pilgrimage. Entire cities struggled under the weight of the gold he left behind. Markets collapsed. Traders fled. A gift that became a curse. Imagine again standing outside the Grand Mosque of Timbuktu. The sun setting, when Mansa Musa, seated on a golden throne beneath its arches, speaking in whispers to his advisors. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still imagine wealth only as something loud, cars, palaces, parades. That's the recursive wealth loop. Culture teaches us that fortune must be seen to be believed. There is also collective legacy distortion. Mansa Musa's story is often reduced to a single fact: the richest man. His reforms, his libraries, his quiet governance often fade behind that golden glow. Think now about your own quiet riches, things you've gathered that no one else sees: resilience, patience, ideas, unspoken. The quiet trap becomes clear. Mansa Musa's greatest legacy was not the gold he spent, but the silence he built around it, places of learning, cities that lived long after his death. He passed away sometime in the 1330s. The exact year remains unclear. His tomb, like much of his life beyond legend, is unmarked, unknown. Imagine one final moment standing in the empty market square of Timbuktu as dawn breaks. Gold dust caught in the morning light. No coins fall now, only memory. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet kingdoms of thought and treasure, ask yourself, if even history's wealthiest rulers were shaped more by silence than by splendor, how many of your own quiet fortunes are waiting not to be spent, but simply to be carried, light as dust, through the deserts of your mind? You stand in the middle of a rainforest clearing where sunlight breaks through tall canopies and sharp golden shafts. The air is heavy, thick, with the scent of orchids and iron. In the center of the clearing stands a wooden platform, its edges stained dark, and there, seated on a carved wooden throne, surrounded by spears and silence, is a woman wrapped in crimson silk. Her face is calm, her eyes unblinking. This is Ranavalona I, Queen of Madagascar, known in history not simply as a ruler, but as the Cruel Queen. Ranavalona ruled the Kingdom of Madagascar from 1828 to 1861. Her reign is remembered in hushed tones across both Malagasy history and colonial European accounts, not for quiet governance but for purges, executions, isolationist policies, and a ruthless grip on her throne. Yet, as with so many figures in history, the story folds in strange ways. Beneath the name Cruel Queen lies a quieter, more complex reality. Official records describe Ranavalona as ordering mass trials by ordeal. Suspected traitors forced to swallow poison to prove their innocence. Forced labor on impossible public works projects. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands may have died under her rule. Yet modern historians reviewing primary sources caution many of these numbers come from hostile colonial accounts seeking to justify European intervention. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called demonization loop distortion. When an outsider culture labels a figure as monstrous, every action is framed through that lens, regardless of its actual context. Imagine now standing at the edge of her palace in Antananarivo, wooden walls painted with blood-red lacquer, drums sounding faintly in the distance. And there, Ranavalona herself, giving no speeches, only silent nods that carry the weight of life or death. There's another layer, isolationist, sovereignty reflex. Psychologists studying leadership under threat show that rulers facing external invasion often tighten internal control to extremes, creating fear within their own people to prevent vulnerability to outsiders. Ranavalona lived in a time of European encroachment. French, British, and Portuguese traders pushed onto Madagascar's coasts. Missionaries brought Christianity, yet she refused their influence, expelling foreigners, burning churches, resisting modernization at a terrible human cost. Now reflect inward. How many quiet empires within yourself have you ruled through fear rather than openness? Psychologists call this self-imposed isolation behavior, closing doors not to keep others out, but to feel control when outside forces seem overwhelming. The paradox deepens with Ranavalona's longevity. Despite plots against her, despite revolts, she ruled for 33 years, longer than many European monarchs of her era. Her methods kept Madagascar independent, while much of Africa fell to colonization. Imagine again standing beneath her throne as night falls. The rainforest singing its quiet, endless song, fires burning low. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still see her only as a villain. That's the recursive tyrant effect. Once a ruler's name becomes a warning, the fuller story fades. There's also collective memory simplification. Malagasy traditions remember Ranavalona both as protector and destroyer, a duality not easily explained in schoolbooks or monuments. Think now about your own quiet reigns, the parts of your life where you've chosen control at the expense of connection. The quiet trap becomes clear. Ranavalona's cruelty may have been her crown, but it was also her prison. She died in 1861, her body entombed in the royal tombs of Ambohimanga, later destroyed by colonial forces. Her resting place erased, her story carried on in echoes. Imagine one final moment standing on the edge of that clearing as dawn breaks. The throne now empty, the platform overgrown with green. Only silence remains. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet jungles of memory and belief, ask yourself, if even history set's cruelest rulers were shaped more by fear than by choice, how many of your own quiet thrones are waiting not to be abandoned, but simply to be opened, letting in the quiet light of something new? After years spent ruling shadows, you stand in a palace where everything reflects, floors polished like water, walls inlaid with silver and jade, and everywhere you turn, mirrors, round, square, tall as doorways, small as coins, each reflecting, not just light, but silence. At the very center of this mirrored labyrinth sits a man dressed in golden robes, seated on a jade throne. His eyes do not meet yours, they look past you, into one of the mirrors. This is Yang Guang, Emperor of Sui, China, remembered as the Mirror Emperor. Yang Guang, also known as Emperor Yang of Sui, ruled from 604 to 618 CE. Official histories describe him as both a visionary and a tyrant, a man who ordered the Grand Canal's construction, uniting northern and southern China, while also bankrupting his empire with endless projects and wars. But beneath these louder facts lies a quieter, stranger truth. Emperor Yang was obsessed with mirrors. Historical accounts from the Sui dynasty, and later Tang-era writings, describe his private chambers as lined entirely with mirrors. Walls, ceilings, even the floor beneath his throne. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called reflective sovereignty syndrome. Cognitive scientists studying leadership behaviors note that rulers isolated by absolute power often become consumed with self-observation, watching themselves endlessly to maintain control. Imagine now walking through those mirrored halls. Every step echoes twice, once in sound, once in image, and at the center, Emperor Yang sits, adjusting his robes, as though caught in a reflection only he can see. There's another layer, identity dissolution paradox. Psychologists show that constant self-monitoring can paradoxically dissolve a person's sense of self. The more they watch, the less real they feel. Emperor Yang reportedly held mirror rituals where he would spend hours inspecting his face for imperfections, while his empire fell apart outside his walls. Psychologists show that constant self-monitoring can Psychologists show that constant self-monitoring can paradoxically dissolve a person's sense of self. The more they watch, the less real they feel. Now reflect inward. How many quiet mirrors do you hold up to yourself each day? Not literal glass, but habits, devices, reflections, and thought. Psychologists call this mirror loop behavior, repeating self-checks until they become prisons. The paradox deepens with the fate of Yang Guang's empire. His massive public works drained resources. His military campaigns failed. Rebellions broke out across the provinces. And still the mirror emperor sat polishing his hallways rather than facing the world beyond. Imagine again standing in his grand audience chamber. The court gathered in silence, Emperor Yang looking not at them but at his own reflection in the ceiling above. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still imagine Chinese emperors as distant figures hidden behind veils and scrolls. That's the recursive sovereign loop. History recording only the outer shell, not the quiet inner obsessions. There's also collective memory mirror effect. Across dynasties, Yang Guang's name became a warning, not just for tyranny, but for rulers lost in their own image. Think now about your own quiet mirrors, the ways you watch yourself, consciously or unconsciously, through social media, through routines, through self-judgment. The quiet trap becomes clear. Yang Guang's rule collapsed not because he could not see, but because he saw only himself. In 618 CE, facing rebellion and betrayal, Yang Guang was assassinated by his own guards. His mirrored palace fell into ruin. The Grand Canal survived, but the mirror emperor was gone. Imagine one final moment, standing in those abandoned halls as dawn breaks, mirrors cracked and darkened. Your own reflection lost among 1,000 others. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet palaces of thought, ask yourself, if even history's grandest rulers could become trapped by their own reflections, how many of your own quiet mirrors are waiting not to be shattered, but simply to be turned away from, so you can finally see, not yourself, but the world beyond the glass? You stand on a cliff overlooking an endless stretch of ocean. Below, waves crash against black volcanic rock. Above, the sky turns orange and purple with the last light of day. And there, standing at the edge, his silhouette sharp against the horizon, is a man crowned not with gold but with feathers, cloaked in woven leaves and scarlet plumes, a spear resting lightly in one hand. This is Kamehameha, the Bird King of Hawaii. History knows him as the first ruler to unite the Hawaiian Islands, a warrior king, a tactician, a lawgiver. But beyond the conquests and unifications lies a quieter truth. Kamehameha ruled through symbols as much as swords, and no symbol carried more weight in his reign than the royal feather cloak. In Hawaiian tradition, the ahula feather cloaks woven from the feathers of rare birds were worn only by the highest chiefs. Kamehameha's cloak was legendary. Thousands of birds contributed to its creation, gathered over years. Red iwi, yellow wee, yellow wee, yellow wee, black mamo. Birds caught, plucked, and released. a process repeated for generations. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called symbolic continuity projection. Cognitive scientists show that when rulers use natural or living elements in their regalia, they extend their power into the environment itself. Kamehameha's cloak wasn't just clothing, it was a map of the island's ecology and spirit. Imagine now standing beside him, not in battle but as he walks through the forests of the big island, his hand gently touching tree branches, his eyes quiet, listening to birds singing in the canopy above. There's another layer, echo authority syndrome. Psychologists studying leadership memory find that rulers remembered for blending nature with rule often gain a kind of recursive legacy. Their power loops back into the land even after they are gone. Kamehameha ruled not from palaces of stone, but from halau, open-air structures of wood and thatch. His laws, including the famous law of the splintered paddle, protected the weak and maintained order across island societies, shaped more by ocean and forest than by walls. Now reflect inward. How many quiet elements of your own identity are tied to the world around you? Not just clothes, but habits, places, familiar paths walked again and again. Psychologists call this environmental identity loop. The paradox deepens with the fate of the feather cloaks. After Kamehameha's death in 1819, many royal artifacts were lost or dispersed. Some cloaks survive in museums today, silent, beautiful, but cut off from the voices and forests that once gave them meaning. Imagine again standing in a museum now looking at one of those cloaks behind glass, the bright red feathers still gleaming softly under the lights. The birds are gone. The king is gone. Only the shape remains. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still picture kings only as men of crowns and castles. Oh, that's the recursive regal bias, forgetting that in some histories, the crown is woven not from gold but from flight. There's also collective memory compression. Kamehameha is often remembered only for battles, forgetting the long years he spent building alliances, protecting traditions, and walking the forests alone. Think now about your own quiet cloaks, symbols or habits you've carried for so long you no longer question their weight. The quiet trap becomes clear. Kamehameha's cloak was not just a sign of rule. It was a living paradox. Made from birds yet grounded, heavy with meaning, yet light as air. He died in 1819, leaving behind a unified kingdom. His burial place remains a secret, hidden by his closest followers to protect his mana spiritual power. Imagine one final moment standing on that same cliff as dawn rises. It's the ocean stretching wide and silent, and in the trees behind you the faint call of a bird that no longer exists, its echo carried through wind and memory. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet forests of thought and tradition, ask yourself, if even history's greatest rulers wore symbols shaped more by nature than by metal, how many of your own quiet identities are waiting not to be shed, but simply to be remembered, feather by feather, song by song, until you see yourself not as a single figure, but as part of a living, endless sky? You stand before a silent stone chapel, its doors closed, its stained glass windows darkened against the rising sun. Ivy creeps along its edges. The air is cold, not with winter, but with history. And through those locked doors, down long shadowed aisles, waits a woman dressed in royal silk, her head bare. No crown rests upon her brow, yet her posture is regal, her eyes calm. This is Lady Jane Grey, the uncrowned Queen of England. Her name is carved into history's quieter chapters. The Queen who ruled for 9 days. The Girl Queen. The Queen without a coronation. But as with all such names, the deeper story lies not in her title, but in her silence. Lady Jane Grey was born in 1537 into the powerful Grey family, closely connected to the Tudor line. Her upbringing was one of sharp contrasts, grand halls and private tutors, royal blood but limited freedom. Trained in languages, philosophy and theology, she was said to be one of the most educated women of her time. But in 1553, After the death of King Edward VI, Jane was placed on the throne, not by popular will, but by political design. England's great families feared the return of Catholicism under Mary Tudor. Jane, a Protestant, became their answer, crowned not in grandeur, but in quiet urgency. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called proxy sovereign syndrome. Psychologists studying historical leadership note how societies sometimes place figureheads in positions of power not for their own abilities, but as placeholders for larger struggles. Imagine now standing beside Jane as she walks through the halls of the Tower of London, her temporary palace, her silent prison, her hands clasped together, her face pale but composed. There's another layer, trapped identity projection. Cognitive scientists show that when individuals are given a role they didn't choose, they often internalize its weight faster than those who sought it. Jane herself reportedly accepted the crown with reluctance, but once it was placed upon her, she carried it with calm dignity. No wild proclamations, no battles, only measured words, soft-spoken in a world swirling with louder storms. Now reflect inward. How many quiet crowns have you carried in your own life? Not chosen by you, but placed upon your head by family, work, or society. Psychologists call this assigned identity loop. The paradox deepens with the end of Jane's reign. Within 9 days, Mary Tudor's forces took control. Jane was imprisoned, charged with treason. Yet even then she remained composed. Her final words before execution at just 16 years old were recorded as calm, reflective, almost scholarly. Imagine again standing in the tower's courtyard as dawn breaks. Jane stepping onto the scaffold. No screams, no tears, only the soft whisper of wind through stone. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still picture queens only as women of crowns and thrones. That's the recursive royal loop. History repeating only its loudest coronations, forgetting its quietest rulers. There's also collective memory dissonance. Jane Grey's story survives as both tragedy and footnote. Some remember her only as a name in school books. Others see her as a symbol of calm in chaos. Think now about your own quiet reigns, the roles and moments you've lived through not as the chosen leader but as the steady center when others couldn't decide. The quiet trap becomes clear. Jane's power was not in ruling, it was in how she carried a crown that was never fully hers. Her body was buried in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula within the tower walls. No grand tomb, no marble effigy, only a quiet plaque beneath cold stone. Imagine one final moment, standing in that chapel as light filters through ancient glass, dust dancing in the air. No throne, no crown, only silence and memory. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet courts of thought, ask yourself, if even history's shortest reigns were shaped more by grace than by power, how many of your own quiet crowns are waiting not to be worn forever, but simply to be carried, for as long as needed, before being set gently down, with nothing left unsaid? You stand before the towering gates of an Egyptian temple, its stone columns rising against a sky washed pale by centuries of desert wind. Hieroglyphs cover every surface, golden light catching on ancient carvings of kings and gods. And yet as you step inside, the hall feels different, not fully sacred, not fully royal. At the far end, beneath a lotus-shaped archway, sits a man in a gilded throne. His robe is Greek, his crown Egyptian, but his voice is silent, his orders whispered by others. This is Ptolemy XIII, known across history as the puppet pharaoh. Ptolemy XIII ascended to Egypt's throne in 51 BCE, just a boy of about 11 years old. His reign was not defined by his own commands but by the hands guiding him. Advisors, generals, court factions, and most famously his sister and co-ruler Cleopatra VII. While Cleopatra would be remembered as Egypt's final true pharaoh, Ptolemy XIII's story is quieter, stranger. A ruler carried along by forces too large for him to control. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called proxy power illusion. Cognitive scientists studying leadership dynamics find that when a leader lacks personal authority, those around them often project the appearance of command while holding the real control themselves. Imagine now standing beside Ptolemy XIII in the palace at Alexandria, marble floors underfoot, halls and statues surrounding him, and yet his gaze drifts not to his advisors, but to the sea beyond the windows where ships gather. There's another layer: youth entrapment syndrome. Psychologists show that when power is placed upon children or adolescents, their sense of self often fractures, caught between public expectation and private confusion. Ptolemy was caught in exactly such a loop. Official decrees bore his seal. Coins were minted in his name, but the reality was different. Every major decision filtered through regents and guardians. His every step monitored. His every word echoed rather than heard. Now reflect inward. How many times in your own life have you found yourself playing a role you did not choose, speaking words assigned to you rather than ones you fully believed? Psychologists call this inherited voice loop. The paradox deepens with Ptolemy's conflict against Cleopatra. As tensions rose between their factions, Ptolemy's advisors pushed him into open rivalry with his sister and into the shadow of Rome itself. Imagine again standing at the edge of Alexandria's harbor as Roman ships arrive, Julius Caesar's fleet cutting through the mist, the boy pharaoh waiting in silence, caught between family and empire. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still picture Egyptian pharaohs as grand, godlike figures. That's the recursive sovereign myth. History recording only the heights, not the quieter hands beneath the crown. They're also collective memory simplification. Ptolemy XIII's name is often reduced to a footnote in Cleopatra's story, his own life flattened into a single role: the puppet king. Think now about your own quiet crowns, titles, or roles you've worn, not because they fit, but because there was no one else. The quiet trap becomes clear. Ptolemy's throne was his cage, power given but never owned. His end came young. In 47 BCE, as war erupted in Alexandria, Ptolemy XIII fled the city, his boat overturning in the Nile. His body was found days later, carried by the river's quiet current. Imagine one final moment standing on the riverbank as dawn breaks. The water smooth as glass, no crown, no voice, only silence where a king once drifted. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet palaces of thought, ask yourself, if even history's grandest titles could belong more to others than to the one who wore them, how many of your own quiet thrones are waiting not to be claimed, but simply to be released, leaving you free to speak, in a voice that is finally, fully, your own? You stand on the edge of a storm-tossed cliff, the sky above dark with rolling clouds, the sea below endless and gray. Waves crash against jagged rocks, sending up mist that carries the salt and cold deep into your skin. And through the fog, a ship appears, black sails snapping in the wind, oars churning through white foam. At the helm stands a woman, tall and fierce, her hair braided with silver and seaweed. This is Grace O'Malley, known in legend and history alike as the Pirate Queen of Ireland. Born around 1530 into the O'Malley clan of Connacht, Grace, Grain Maiol in Irish, lived in a world split between land and sea, between Gaelic tradition and the growing reach of English rule. From her earliest years she was drawn not to courtly halls but to ships. Stories say she begged her father to take her on trading expeditions, shaving her hair in defiance when told no. But Grace O'Malley was more than a rebellious daughter. She became the matriarch of a maritime empire, commanding fleets of ships, raiding English strongholds, collecting taxes from coastal settlements. Yet beneath the noise of cannons and sails, her rule carried a quieter paradox. She fought for power in a world where no throne existed for her. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called unanchored sovereignty syndrome. Psychologists studying leadership outside formal structures find that some rulers establish power through constant motion, refusing fixed titles or seats to maintain control. Imagine now standing aboard her ship, as rain lashes down. Grace gripping the wheel, her face set against the storm, no crown on her head, no royal court behind her, only wind, water, and will. There's another layer, gendered pirate archetype. In historical memory, piracy is often framed as a male domain. Grace's story disrupts this loop. Scholars argue that her legend persists not just because of her raids, but because she stood at the intersection of two cultural myths, the chieftain and the pirate. Grace negotiated directly with Elizabeth I of England in 1593, one queen facing another. Their meeting was recorded in hushed tones across both countries, Grace refusing to bow, Elizabeth refusing to underestimate her. Now reflect inward. How many quiet empires in your own life have been built, not in offices or homes, but between places in transit, in movement, in the spaces others overlook? Psychologists call this transitional identity loop. The paradox deepens with Grace's later years. While her power declined as English authority tightened, she remained a figure of local legend, walking between worlds, Gaelic and English, rebel and ruler. Imagine again standing on a deserted beach as dawn breaks, her ships now gone. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still imagine pirates as wild, lawless men. That's the recursive adventure loop. History preserving the loudest images while quieter figures drift beneath the waves. There's also collective legacy drift. Grace O'Malley's story survives in fragmented songs, oral histories, scattered documents, never fully captured, always moving. Think now about your own quiet ships. The parts of yourself that sail beyond the roles others expect. Projects started in secret, dreams pursued between obligations. The quiet trap becomes clear. Grace's crown was the horizon, a ruler whose power was defined by refusing to stand still. She is believed to have died around 1603, the same year as Elizabeth I, two queens passing quietly out of history's formal records, leaving only ripples. Imagine one final moment standing at the edge of that same cliff as daylight returns. The sea calm now, but on the wind faint echoes of sails and voices. A queen still riding the storm. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet oceans of thought, ask yourself, if even history's most defiant rulers carried their crowns in motion rather than in stone, how many of your own quiet thrones are waiting not to be found, but simply to be sailed, one horizon at a time until the world remembers that not all rulers sit. Some simply stand at the helm. You stand beneath a sky that glows not with the sun but with flame. The air is thick with the scent of burning wood, iron and something older, dust and history mixed together. Around you rise the walls of a fortress made not from stone but from red earth and dark timber. And at its heart, atop a platform carved from sacred wood, stands a man. His robe is the color of embers. His crown forged in gold glints like sparks in the night. This is Osei Tutu, the Fire King of the Ashanti Empire. Osei Tutu ruled in the late 17th and early 18th centuries in what is now Ghana. His name echoes quietly through West African history, not always shouted, not always sung, but always remembered. His reign was not defined by conquest alone, but by something more elemental, unity forged in flame. The Ashanti Empire began as a confederation of clans. Before Osei Tutu, these clans fought among themselves, small kings and warlords battling over territory, gold, and honor. But under his rule, they were bound together through ritual warfare and the creation of the Golden Stool, an object said to hold the soul of the Ashanti people. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called symbolic cohesion loop. Cognitive scientists studying societal structures show that when leaders create central symbols tied to survival or identity, these symbols become as powerful as any army. Imagine now standing in the central square of Kumasi, Osei Tutu's capital, as the Golden Stool is revealed. Carved from gold, untouched by earth or mortal hands, warriors kneel, priests chant. Osei Tutu watches in silence, flames flickering around him. There's another layer, fire as governance mechanism. In Ashanti tradition, fire symbolized both destruction and cleansing. Ose Tutu's rise involved burning old rivalries away, literally and symbolically. Villages united, fortresses rebuilt stronger. Now reflect inward. How many times in your own life have you faced moments where burning something away, habits, fears, even relationships, became the only path forward? Psychologists call this purification cycle behavior. The paradox deepens with Ose Tutu's method of rule. He, though feared for his military strength, he governed through consensus and council. His image was not that of an untouchable god-king, but of a ruler standing among equals, first among chiefs, but not separate. Imagine again standing before him during one of these councils. No gold throne, no solitary voice, only quiet words passed between leaders, like embers shared from one fire to another. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still picture African empires only through the lens of European written history, loud conquests, simplified narratives. That's the recursive colonial loop, history repeating only the versions that fit outside eyes. There is also collective legacy misdirection. The Ashanti Empire is often remembered today for its resistance to British colonization, but its foundations under Ose Tutu are spoken of less often outside West Africa. Think now about your own quiet fires, the moments you've chosen to burn something down so something larger could rise. The quiet trap becomes clear. Ose Tutu's real power was not his gold nor his armies, but his ability to turn flame into unity, fear into strength. His reign ended in battle. A legend says he was shot crossing a river, a moment both tragic and quietly fitting, the king of fire lost to water. Imagine one final moment standing on the riverbank as dawn breaks, the fires behind you fading, the water calm now. But in the ashes of the night, the shape of the golden stool remains. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet kingdoms of thought, ask yourself, if even history's fiercest rulers built their strength, not by holding flame, but by passing it forward, how many of your own quiet fires are waiting not to burn endlessly, but simply to be shared? Once upon a time, in a quaint little village nestled among rolling hills and towering trees, there lived a curious boy named Oliver. Once upon a time, in a quaint little village nestled among rolling hills and towering trees, once upon a time, in a quaint little village nestled among rolling hills and towering trees, once upon a time, in a quaint little village nestled among rolling hills and towering trees, once upon a time, in a quaint little village nestled among rolling hills and towering trees, there lived a curious boy named Oliver. Until your whole world glows quietly with a strength others can yet see, but always feel. You stand in a grand hall lined with tall arched windows, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and quiet rain falling outside. Beyond those windows, Rio de Janeiro stretches wide and green mist curling along its hills. Inside, the chandeliers glow faintly, their light reflected on polished floors, and at the far end, seated beneath the fading gold of a royal banner, sits a man. His hair silver, his face calm, his robe embroidered not with crowns or swords, but with books, stars, quiet symbols. This is Dom Pedro II, the last emperor of Brazil. Crowned at just 5 years old, Pedro II ruled from 1831 until 1889, leading Brazil through independence, modernization, and eventual transition into a republic. But unlike the rulers of louder empires, Pedro II's reign was marked by something quieter, a deep contemplative stillness. A king less interested in parades than in poetry. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called Scholar King syndrome. Psychologists studying leadership archetypes find that rulers who embrace intellectual life over military or economic expansion often create legacies built not on conquests but on knowledge. Imagine now standing beside Pedro II in his private library, arrows of books and languages from across the world. Scientific instruments. A quiet gramophone playing music in the corner. The emperor seated with a pen in hand, writing letters to scholars in Europe and America. There lived a curious boy named Oliver. Attentional legacy. Quieting cognitive scientists note that some leaders, aware of their position as the last of their kind, consciously choose to soften their rule, preparing the way for what comes next. Pedro II saw Brazil through years of stability, yet he sensed the monarchy's end approaching. Rather than fight it, he withdrew from court life more and more, focusing on education, abolition of slavery, and correspondence with scientists like Charles Darwin. Now reflect inward. How many parts of your own life have been shaped, not by building something louder, but by preparing for a quieter ending? Psychologists call this sunset phase adaptation. The paradox deepens with Pedro II's personal choices. While emperor, he lived simply, refusing grand wealth, often traveling without guards, carrying a notebook rather than a sword. Imagine again walking through Rio's streets at night and seeing him pass by, unrecognized by many, a quiet man in a dark coat, watching the city he ruled without needing to announce himself. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still imagine emperors only through opulence and command. That's the recursive sovereign loop. History teaching us to remember rulers only when they make the most noise. There's also collective memory diminishment. Outside Brazil, few remember Dom Pedro II as one of the 19th century's longest reigning monarchs. Yet within his nation, his name carries quiet respect. Think now about your own quiet crowns, titles, roles, responsibilities you've carried, not because they made you powerful, but because they let others grow. The quiet trap becomes clear. Pedro II's true reign was not over Brazil's land, but over its future, shaping a republic through gentle retreat. In 1889, Brazil became a republic.
Pedro II
Was exiled, spending his final years in Paris. He died in 1891, in a small hotel room, with only books and letters for company. Imagine one final moment standing outside that hotel as dawn rises, rain falling lightly on the streets. Bonjour, royal carriage, reign. No army, only a quiet name written in history's quieter pages. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet halls of memory and belief, ask yourself, if even history's longest reigning emperors could carry their crowns more like notebooks than like swords, how many of your own quiet empires are waiting not to expand, but simply to be closed gently, like a book, set carefully back on the shelf, its pages still warm, with everything it once contained? You stand at the edge of a frozen plain. Snow stretches in every direction, white, endless, quiet. The air burns with cold so sharp it feels like glass against your skin. Ahead of you, rising from the snow like the last tower of a forgotten city, is a wooden palace, its walls rimmed with frost, its windows sealed shut with ice, and inside, standing alone beneath a ceiling carved with eagles and stars, is a man, his beard white as frost, his crown rimmed not with jewels but with frost. Bite. This is Ivan Fix, the frozen Tsar of Siberia. His name is one that drifts through Russian history like a half-buried statue. Ivan the Fix, crowned Tsar of Russia in 1740, as a baby, declared emperor by political forces beyond his control, and yet, his reign was defined not by rule, but by imprisonment. Almost his entire life was spent in frozen exile, locked in fortress after fortress, palace after palace, hidden away from the world. This ties into a psychological phenomenon called eternal pretender syndrome. Psychologists studying historical leadership note that some rulers are remembered more for the power they never used than for any act of rule itself. Imagine now standing inside one of Ivan's frozen prisons, the walls covered in frost, candles flickering low, and there he sits, a man grown tall and silent, a crown carved into his mind, but never into his hand. There's another layer: isolation, identity collapse. Cognitive scientists show that when individuals are denied contact, agency, and purpose for too long, their sense of self begins to dissolve, not in fire but in cold. Ivan VI spent decades under guard, moved from fortress to fortress across the vast emptiness of Siberia and northern Russia. No court, no visitors, no voice outside his own. Now reflect inward. How many quiet parts of your own life have been locked away, not by others, but by yourself? Thoughts, hopes, ideas frozen beneath routines. Psychologists call this silent self-banishment. The paradox deepens with Ivan's legacy. Though removed from power as a child, he remained a threat in the eyes of Russia's rulers. Empress Elizabeth ordered his name erased from records. Empress Catherine the Great kept him alive only as a secret, his existence a quiet knot at the center of an empire's history. Imagine again walking across the frozen plains to his final prison, Schlüsselburg Fortress. The wind cutting across your face, guards watching silently. And inside, even pacing the same circle of stone again and again. Even now, knowing these quieter truths, part of you may still imagine tsars only as men on thrones. That's the recursive imperial loop. History remembering crowns only when they shine, not when they freeze. There's also collective memory frosting. Ivan's story is often left out of the larger Russian narrative, his life seen as too quiet, too tragic, too unsettling. Think now about your own frozen thrones. The roles or dreams you've left untouched for so long they feel cold when you try to remember them. The quiet trap becomes clear. Ivan Thies ruled nothing, yet he existed as a ruler longer than many tsars who wore the crown in public. His life ended in 1764, during an attempted rescue by officers loyal to his forgotten claim. Ivan was killed by his guards, his last breath leaving not in a shout, but in a frozen whisper. Imagine one final moment standing outside Schlüsselburg as dawn rises. The fortress dark against a pale sky, snow falling in slow, endless spirals. No banners fly, no horns sound, only silence and frost. So tonight, as you drift deeper into your own quiet Siberias of thought, ask yourself, if even history's quietest rulers could carry a crown carved not from gold but from ice, how many of your own silent thrones are waiting not to be reclaimed, but simply to be remembered, carried gently in your mind, like a single snowflake that never fully melts, still cold, still beautiful, still yours? But now, as you sit in the stillness after all these echoes, a quieter thought takes shape. You've wandered through 25 thrones tonight, 25 names carved in stone, whispered in legend, some remembered in gold, others in frost. From Roman emperors crowned in silence to African kings burning unity into flame. From queens without crowns to rulers frozen in time. Each story opened quietly with a title. Each one ended without truly closing. What does it mean to rule? Not as history teaches it, flags, battles, but as it really happens. A ruler is not always the one seated on the tallest throne. Sometimes, a king is a boy behind a mask. A queen is a figure locked away in a tower. A sultan is a shadow behind silk curtains. And if that is true, if power can be silent, hidden, even forgotten, then the real question sharpens into focus. How many crowns have you carried quietly in your own life, without ever knowing it? Psychologists studying role persistence describe something called the unseen crown loop. It happens when a person's actions carry weight beyond their awareness, when small choices, quiet habits, or unnoticed responsibilities shape the world of others without ever being named as rule. Brother, sister, leader, friend, artist, creator, ghost. Think now in this moment about all the titles you've worn. How many of those roles have passed like shadow empires beneath your feet, invisible but real? Each section tonight wasn't just history, it was a mirror. The mad Roman emperor's crown shaped by paranoia, mirroring the parts of you that overthink until even certainty feels dangerous. The sleeping king of Spain mirroring the parts of your life that have drifted too long without waking. The mirror emperor of China, reflecting not power but the trap of self-watching until nothing else exists. The pirate queen of Ireland reminding you that some thrones are carried on ships, in storms, never still, never fixed. And now the loop tightens. The first section bled into the next. The last section folds back into the first. Every ruler you met tonight shared one unspoken truth. The frozen Tsar becomes the sleeping king, becomes the silent emperor. They believed, at least for a moment, that their story would last forever. But here is the quiet trap: it never does. Empires fade, palaces crumble. Crowns are set down, except in memory. Because if you are hearing these words now, if you've carried yourself through each section, each echo, each paradox, then the last loop is this. Except in you. You were the ruler all along. The thrones were your decisions. The empires were your habits. If all these monarchs ruled through silence, shadow, movement, flame, frost, and now, as the final echoes fade, as the candle burns lower, as sleep pulls you further down, there is only one question left. The frozen palaces were the quiet places in your mind where old titles still sleep, not with a crown. If their legacies survive not through volume but through quiet persistence, then what part of you is still waiting to rule itself? Not with a flag. That power never truly ends, but with a single quiet thought. Good night. It only changes hands. And tonight those hands were yours. Sleep deeply. And remember, the crown you thought belonged to history was always sitting quietly on your own head.